warm welcome to our policy podcast, Building Wealth, Building Community, hosted by Duncan and Andy from the Social Enterprise Scotland policy team. Social enterprises and other types of inclusive democratic business models are building a better economy across urban and rural Scotland. We'll be talking about some of the big policy issues of the day and, crucially, the real-world impacts in our local communities.
Hello, welcome back. This is the Social Enterprise Scotland podcast, Building Wealth, Building Community, with me, Andy Patterson, the Policy Officer, and
Duncan Thorpe, Policy Manager, Social Enterprise Scotland.
And we've just had an election. So we're currently looking at the results as they're tumbling in. We have the finalised results, so hopefully we'll go through, see what that means and what that could mean for the next few years of the Parliament. But Duncan, you've got the full results in front of you. What's your first take on what's happening here? We've got the SNP on 58 seats, we have Reform on 17, we have Scottish Labour on 17, we have the Scottish Greens on 15, we have the Scottish Conservatives on 12, and we have the Scottish Liberal Democrats on 10.
Well, my first thought is I suppose it's the return of the Rainbow Parliament. That's kind of my first instinct around all this. So we've got lots of different parties represented, very diverse views, I would say, to say the least, in terms of different beliefs, different policies, etc. So I think that's interesting in itself, I would say, to start with. I think it's quite healthy as well. I think it does return to those days of consensus decision making. Obviously, the SNP minority government, and it comes back to that real democratic kind of way of working, I think, as well. So I think it's a good thing. I think it's healthy.
Yeah, and we'll obviously see one party lose an MSP for whoever is elected as the presiding officer in the Parliament. We'll find that out later on this week. But I think what is interesting is something that we said before the election is this fragmentation, as some people describe it, but I think you describe it in a much more positive light as a Rainbow Parliament. It's probably a more realistic view of how Scotland as a country thinks and votes. So I think what we said before was that some parties hold a little bit of a balance in power because the SNP will lose a couple of seats, which is what they did. So it'll be interesting to see who the SNP end up working with and relying on. John Swinney said after his victory, because he's most likely going to be the First Minister for this next 5 years, is that he is more than happy to work with anybody, but he excludes the Reform Party from that. So it'll be interesting to see what Scottish Labour might want from the SNP, what the Conservatives might want, what the Greens want, what the Liberal Democrats will want. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats worked with the SNP before the election to pass a few of John Swinney's budgets as well. Scottish Labour abstained from those votes, so they didn't need to support anyway, but they still did and still conceded some points. So do you think we're likely to see a minority government with John Swinney as First Minister more likely to engage with other political parties and maybe lean on them a little bit more for some kind of consensus policy making? Yeah,
and I suppose at one point we had the Scottish Greens in kind of some kind of coalition agreement with the SNP as well. So that's not going to happen in that same way anymore, I think, as well. It will be a case of, on a case-by-case basis, depending on the policy, if it's a budget, whatever, we're going to individual parties or more than one party, I think. So there'll be a bit more of the normalisation of that kind of negotiation, I think, as well. I think that'd be really interesting. And it won't just be them relying on one party, as I said. It'll be various parties apart from Reform, which John Swinney has excluded from those conversations.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting to see what parties are successful in implementing any of their policies from their own manifestos. We had a manifesto that we published before the election, and some of the ideas that were in that I definitely recognise from a few of the manifestos that eventually got published, so it'll be interesting to see what passes. My personal view of the manifesto is that there was a lot of crossover. If you had a kind of Venn diagram of Scottish politics, there was some things that were kept across all the political party manifestos. We'll get into some of those later, but something that's worth pointing out is the Parliament didn't get the opportunity to pass every single piece of legislation that it wanted to. There was quite a few bills going into the Scottish Parliament before the election, which were pushed into their third stage and then eventually passed very, very quickly. So I think something we'll see from this next Parliament is maybe bits and pieces of legislation that maybe didn't get the opportunity to get passed during the previous session. So something that we'll see being focused on is the Community Wealth Building Bill. Did get passed in the last session. But within the bill, there needs to be a minister who takes responsibility for community wealth building. They need to set out a statement, and they also need to set out measures of what they see as community wealth building. So chances are we'll see that within this Parliament. If we're fortunate, we'll see that happen very quickly and before potentially the summer recess, but we obviously won't hold our breath for that either because there's a lot that needs to happen throughout this time. It's worth pointing out to those who maybe don't know the Scottish parliamentary process, if you get elected in as an MSP, you're not immediately an MSP from the day that you're elected. You have to wait to be sworn into the Parliament. You also need to be given your buddy within the Scottish Parliament so you can learn how to do what and where. Alison Johnson, the presiding officer from the last Parliament, will have a job to kind of induct the new MSPs. It's very much first day of high school for these MSPs out who are learning the corridors to go down, where their pals will be out, what classes they're taking, which will be their offices and potentially committee positions. So that will take about 2 weeks, really. And there'll also be elections for First Ministers and to see who gets placed into cabinet positions and junior minister positions as well. So Duncan, what pieces of legislation do you think we're likely to see come back from the previous Parliament?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things. I think the Human Rights Bill and obviously community wealth building was passed, as you said, but that will be kind of the implementation of that will be a priority for the next Parliament as well. There's also the Private Members Bill, the Ecocide Bill as well, actually, which needs to make progress. And initiatives like the IDBM report, Inclusive Democratic Business Models report, and the Democracy Matters initiative as well. So it's just trying to make progress on these pieces of legislation, but also initiatives as well, which will very likely continue, I would say, under the SNP government. So there'll be lots of continuation in that sense as well. And we can kind of predict what's going to be in the programme for government by looking at the SNP manifesto as well as a number of policies in there. Again, a lot of this is going to be continuation from the previous government actually as well, and continuing that kind of trend towards, you know, continuing fair work, for example, continuing procurement reform, all these things that have been taking place over the past decade or more. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what that looks like, obviously, with a minority government as well, because it won't just be based on what was in the SNP manifesto, it'll of course be based on what's potentially in other party manifestos as well, probably excluding reform. So it'd be interesting to see what those negotiations, what happens with the negotiations really, and what actually results from that in terms of programme for government. And I think particularly in terms of that programme for government, there will be a lot of negotiations with pretty much all the parties, as I've said, apart from reform, in terms of what that looks like.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out as well that we have two parties within the Scottish Parliament of the Scottish Labour Party and Reform, who have both been elected in on 17 seats. It's a bit of a misnomer that people say that there's an official opposition within the Scottish Parliament. That's not how the Scottish Parliament works. We have a much more European-style system where political parties are not meant to win majorities. It has happened, it does happen. The SNP famously did that in 2011, but that's been the only one. So the Parliament is specifically set up for parties to work together to pass legislation, which I think is a much more democratic way of passing legislation. So there is no official opposition, but I do imagine that the parties to be most critical of the SNP will probably be the Reform Party. The Conservatives, I'm sure, will have a few things to say, even though they've had a huge reduction in numbers. They're still returning 12 MSPs to the Scottish Parliament, and Scottish Labour, I think, will try to squeeze the SNP over certain areas that they focused on during the election, probably education and health. Throughout the manifestos from across all the political parties during the election, something that was chimed into and mentioned in all of them was Scotland's economy. And basically, there's going to be a decrease in the amount of money that the Scottish Government has to spend over the next 5 years. The Scottish Fiscal Commission have pointed this out. So there needs to be ways of generating new revenue. The only party I can remember that decided to say that they wanted to increase certain taxes was the Scottish Greens Party to raise revenue. So that was to do with kind of a mansion tax, private airplane tax to reduce the emissions from private jets. But the other political parties kind of focused on growing the economy, because if you grow the economy, you can have a bigger tax revenue. That's something that Reform really focused on, because they wanted some tax cuts. But obviously we have the SNP most likely being in the balance of power here. So what's our offer essentially to this new Scottish Parliament? Talking about the economy, how can we make it more resilient? How can we make it stronger? Is there something maybe they can engage with us?
Absolutely. There might be one or two things, I think. Yes, I mean, social enterprise, social economy is all about the economy. The clue's in the name, I guess. So I think one of our key messages is going to be we are one of the key solutions. You need a strong, resilient, sustainable economy, a democratic economy. We can use those words now, I think, and we can contribute greatly towards that. So that's implementing the Inclusive Democratic Business Models report, which I mentioned before, which dramatically increases the number of cooperatives, social enterprises and employee-owned businesses in Scotland. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there for us to kind of get those key messages across to the new MSPs. And again, there are a lot of new MSPs as well, a lot of new people for us to speak to. But the economy, it's foundational. I mean, they need to get the economy right. All politicians, all governments need to get the economy right, and they know that as well. And we can certainly help towards that, I think, in quite a dramatic way. And just to raise the issue of tax, which I'm always banging on about as well. So tax is going to be a big part of that, as you mentioned. There are these massive financial challenges, but there are also the opportunities as well around tax reform. Again, repeating myself, which which I talk about all the time, about council tax reform, business rates reform, land taxes. There's lots of options here as well. We just need some imagination, some creativity around all this kind of stuff. But yeah, the Scottish Government is working with this specific envelope at the moment of finance. They need to make some difficult decisions, as they always say, kind of thing. But yeah, there are options out there for not just raising more income, but spending better as well, spending on prevention or whatever it might be, but just looking at the entire budget and seeing what money could be directed into other places, particularly from our perspective, investment in communities, investment in community ownership, investment in the social economy kind of thing. So I think that's obviously from our perspective. But yeah, that one of our key messages is really saying, look, we want a growing, thriving economy as well, and social enterprise, cooperatives, employee and businesses, we are very much part of the solution to that.
Yeah, completely. And I'm glad that you mentioned the P word of prevention, because I think there's been a kind of acknowledgement across the political parties as well, is that a preventative way forward is absolutely needed to kind of insulate the Scottish budget from certain crises and certain shocks that can happen to it. It's something that was brought up in the Christie Commission, which gets mentioned all the time, which is from 2011, so we're 15 years on from the Christie Commission. But that talks about preventative efforts and to try and change the spend there. So I imagine there will be a bit of a push for this. There'll be a changing of funds coming into the Scottish Government just due to that fiscal gap that's been pointed out. So I think investment is the right word to use here. I think there's huge opportunities to invest in local social enterprises, mainly due to the fact that they're worth it. Any pound that you spend in a social enterprise, the environmental or social impact that you get back is worth 3 or 4. That's huge for investment. If you saw that on a chart that you're getting more than what you put in back, you're seeing a huge return, actually.
Yeah, and I think it's another key message as well, as, again, especially to the new MSPs, is that you make small investments in communities and you'll have massive social impact and massive economic impact as well. I think that's a really important key message. So there'll be a lot of these kind of messages, again, around prevention, a lot of stuff we talked about before, early intervention, etc. We'll be repeating those messages to the new government, but also the new MSPs as well.
Yeah, and that's a job for us. Obviously, we've got many new faces within the Scottish Parliament now. So something that we'd quite like to do is, any of them are listening, is that we're more than happy to have a conversation with you. We have plenty of resources and materials for you to have a look at when we're talking about growing a stronger social economy across Scotland. There's some great case studies, and without a shadow of a doubt, there will be a fantastic social enterprise in your constituency that we can take you out to show you how it's done on the ground. So not only do we have the data to back it up, we have the in-person stories on the ground, because more often than not, the reason that someone becomes a social entrepreneur is that they want to improve their community, but also something has happened to them directly. They've seen a gap in the market and they've gone, how can I fill this gap, but also make sure that the community around me thrives as well?
And I think that's just so powerful. Again, I say this all the time, but in terms of us speaking to MSPs, we can talk about the social enterprise census and the statistics, and we can talk about policies, which are really, really important. But it's when they see social enterprises and other inclusive democratic businesses in their local communities, in their constituencies, when they see them, they visit them, they get their picture taken for the paper, that kind of thing, but they also learn about the stories of those social entrepreneurs and what they've achieved and what they're doing in the local communities. And I think a lot of the new MSPs will be really surprised in a really pleasant way about what's actually happening in their local areas. Some of them will be already engaged with social enterprises in previous lives, but a lot of them will be like, oh, that I did not know this existed, kind of thing. There's a huge amount of innovation within our communities, which is kind of hidden a lot of the time as well. So it's certainly our job to connect new MSPs in particular with those social enterprises and other similar community groups.
Yeah, and we'll get opportunities to talk to whoever ends up being the minister overlooking social enterprise, whether that's at a cabinet position or not. We'll be having our summit, the Social Enterprise Summit, in Dundee on June the 17th to bring the kind of sector together to talk about some of these bigger issues. Again, it's called Building Wealth, Building Community. That's something that we're really focusing on here. So there's been invites sent out to that position. So hopefully we'll see them then and they can have some engagement on the ground with our members, because it's something that we'll emphasise to our members as well. It's like, you could have a new MSP in your local area. It's worth engaging with them sooner rather than later. Like I say, they're still going through the induction process, but at the time this is out and published, they should have their contacts and information up there. So make sure that you can try and get along to a surgery, introduce yourself to your new MSP and let them know just about what's happening on the ground. And if you already know your MSP, from they've been re-elected, then there's no harm reminding them of where you are, because during the summer recess, a lot of MSPs like to get out and about in their constituencies. So take that opportunity to come grab them and show them what you're about.
Yeah, and absolutely. I think that's one of the most powerful things is that direct connection. So bypassing us basically and bypassing us, our colleagues and stuff like that, and really making those direct connections between MSPs and our members. I think that's so important as well. So again, we'll help our members in many ways to do that. We'll help them with how you do that, all this kind of stuff. But yeah, as you said, if you don't know your local MSPs, introduce yourselves, go to one of their surgeries, etc. And it's worth reminding people there's your local constituency MSP plus your regional ones as well. And I would say make connections with all of them if you can. Obviously, we're aware people are very busy, etc. But yeah, if you can make connections with the regional ones as well as your local constituency one, that will really help actually as well. And just really tell your story, tell them what you're doing, tell them how you're contributing to changing people's lives, to the economy, that kind of thing. I think that's really important. So yeah, I think it'll be a big focus of ours, as policy officers, to really help members do that and make those direct connections.
Yeah, completely. And there's a job for us as well. So if there's anybody sitting out there who's like, oh, I love the social enterprise cross-party group within the Parliament, will it come back? We're absolutely focused on that. So we'll be engaging with MSPs from across the political spectrum to make sure that our cross-party group is back up and firing. And as soon as it is, we will let you all know about what's happening there. So Duncan, one of the little bits of legislation that we kind of quickly talked about there was the work to do with local democracy matters. And I think that's something that's worth pointing out about the election that's just happened. We had figures published of the turnout for the election, and compared to 2021, we're down kind of just below average of usual turnout at these elections. A lot of political commentators refer to this as the scunnered effect of people are just sick of politics and they don't want to engage with it anymore. I think being back down to average is kind of normal. I would put a little caveat on 2021 election, which had the highest turnout since devolution. That was during the COVID pandemic. A lot of people were at home. A lot of people maybe didn't have anything else to do that day. So potentially that increased the election turnout. But something I want to focus on there is that election turnout is usually in the kind of mid-50s percentage-wise. Westminster elections often have a higher turnout, and in local elections are really poor for turnout. So I think there's an opportunity in here for kind of local democracy matters work to carry on, continue, and to kind of let people know that if we can devolve powers to a lower level locally, we could increase democratic participation across Scotland and up those levels of participation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's talking about the system kind of thing, which is what we do quite a lot. I think the system as it currently stands doesn't really work very well for a lot of people. As you say, the turnout, even if when it was slightly higher, it's still not very high, in the 60s or whatever it might be. It's kind of like, it's not very high. So the system itself isn't working. People don't feel represented. They don't feel they're being listened to, I think, a lot of the time. And, as we can see in the wider political sphere as well, there's a lot of people turning to other parties, not just the established ones as well. So there's a lot of symptoms, I think, of quite a bit of a broken system. And as you say, Democracy Matters, I think, is a really good example of work which is initiated by the Scottish Government and partners, COSLA and ourselves and other organisations, to really examine that and look at that very local level of democracy as well, the kind of community council level of democracy, how we might improve that quite dramatically, devolve power downwards to local neighbourhoods and streets, that kind of thing, from local authorities, which aren't really local, they are kind of regional authorities a lot of the time as well. So yeah, it's looking at all those things, I think, as well, and just looking at alternatives to the current system we have. Some good examples of the Scottish Parliament itself being quite innovative as well. So they've used people's panels in their committees, which are basically small juries of ordinary citizens who've come together over a particular topic. Some of the committees have done various inquiries involving those people's panels, which is really important. And obviously there's alternative decision-making, things like citizens' assemblies, which I'm always banging on about, which can be used in various ways, very successfully, in fact, as well in other countries as well. And again, it's worth looking at what other countries have done around this kind of innovation, just to really make sure people are empowered.
And I think democracy is a key thing to social enterprises in the wider sector as well. When we talk about democracy, we're not just talking about kind of the voting system or how elections work. We're also talking about the economy. What we want to do is see a much bigger percentage of ownership across normal people within the economy. We'll be running an event at the Festival of Politics in August called the Scottish Economy. Why don't we own more? And I think that's quite important to point out, because we need people to have a shared ownership here. People need to feel like they're engaged, they're a part of the economy here. It needs to start working for them. That's one of the biggest complaints, I think, across this election. And you'll see that not just in Scotland, but across all of the United Kingdom, that there's been a complete break of the traditional political parties. what was a 2-horse race in UK politics is now kind of turned into 5 or 6 parties. We've seen that within our parliament. That's a good thing because our parliament allows that kind of representation. It'll be very different in the Westminster context, but we don't have to worry about that for another 3 years. So I think it'll be really interesting, and we hope to engage further with kind of Scottish Government. There was the Economic Democracy Group put together by Scottish Government, which should hopefully continue to work within this next session, and we'll continue to engage with them as well. We're hopeful for community wealth building legislation to start being implemented, and we will work with public bodies and local authorities to help them put together local community wealth building plans as well. So we're an absolute resource to be used by policymakers at local or national level of government across Scotland. So yeah, we're happy to engage, and if you're a social enterprise and you would like to be used as a case study for community wealth building, just get in touch with us and we'll try to put something together for you to show to your local constituency and regional MSPs.
I think it's really important just to bridge that gap between what we mean by democracy in the economy and democracy politically, I think, as well. It's a bit of a strange one, I think, for a lot of people to hear. But the previous Scottish Government did talk about economic democracy for a change as well, which is quite a new thing. So we are talking about bridging that gap really and raising awareness of what that means, to be honest. So yeah, economic democracy is really cooperative social enterprises, community ownership kind of thing. That's democracy in our economy. And obviously we've got elections as well. But all these things do feed into each other as well. And we need to kind of get that. Yeah, so it's also bridging that gap between different policy areas as well. So Democracy Matters, the IDBM report, all these different things. There's so much overlap here. And we need to make sure these are kind of brought together in some cohesive way, I think, as well. And the Community Wealth Building Act is what it is going to be soon. Will be a big part of that, I think, as well. So we're very much focused on community wealth building, I think, going forward, and just bringing together a lot of these policy areas, whether it's land reform, IDBM development, whatever it might be. Yeah,
it's point to point that no singular policy stands by itself. Everything intercuts with absolutely everything. So when it can be a habit that sometimes you'll work on a specific policy for so long that's kind of all you see in front of you. But once you take 2 steps back, you realise that it interconnects with a whole lot of other policy as well. Some people find that painful. I personally love it. I think it's a really interesting thing of policy. Kind of shows you the consequences of how certain policies point out, good and bad. But that's all part of the job and something that we're here to get stuck in with the new Scottish Parliament. So thanks for listening so far. Our next episode will be a kind of breakdown of what the Scottish Government looks like. We'll be interviewing social entrepreneurs and other organisations within the sector, within communities, within social enterprise, so you can get a much stronger view of what's happening in Scotland. So yeah, thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next one. Goodbye for now. Thanks for listening, folks. This has been Building Wealth, Building Community, Social Enterprise Scotland podcast with me, Andy Patterson, and Duncan Thorpe. If you need to get in touch at any time about all things social enterprise, please do visit socialenterprise.scot. Goodbye for now.